Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here in Manhattan. We are been working hard to organize this for a number of months. You'll see a lot of, you've met a lot of K-Staters as you checked in. There's been a lot of hands that went into organizing and pulling this off. And if you have a chance to thank those people in the course of the day, why they deserve a big hand in doing that. My name is Sandy Johnson, a member of the Beef Reproduction Task Force, and pleased to be hosting you here today. We do have a tight schedule, and so we'll be working hard to keep on time. I want to also let you know that if you have transportation needs for this evening or tomorrow for the labs, we can provide help with that. Check with the registration desk. And also, you know, in these meetings you tend to eat a lot, but we have a nice steak for you this evening, so don't overdo on the little snacky things so you can't eat your steak tonight. And we will hopefully have a good discussion group out there this evening as well. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ken Odie, who is going to be our moderator today. He's been our department chair here for a number of years, and he knows how to crack the whip and keep us on time, so he's been charged with that this morning.
Sandy, thank you, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. We're delighted to host this conference here in Manhattan. If you go back, Sandy briefed me a little bit on this meeting, and I think the first meeting was held in 2002 here in Manhattan, Kansas. And this conference has been held most years since 2002, some years in multiple locations, and this is, in fact, I think a very impressive organization with a very impressive history. As many of you know, my background prior to leaving Colorado State University is in beef cattle reproduction. And as I look at the progress made in beef cattle reproduction, and particularly the applications of technology to beef cattle reproduction in the last 20 years, it's indeed impressive. If you look at the advances in fixed-time AI, advances in sex semen, in vitro fertilization, and particularly the application of those technologies to cow-calf production systems, the progress has actually been significant, and I think this organization and the leadership of this organization deserves a lot of credit for those advances in working together. We also are very proud of what we do here at Kansas State University. We take a lot of pride in being a very student-oriented and student-focused animal science department, emphasizing applied research and outreach. We've hosted since in the last about 7 years, we've hosted the Reciprocal Meats Conference here in 2011. We hosted the American Society of Animal Science and Red Angus Association of America Beef Profit Conference in 2012. And then last year we hosted the Beef Improvement Federation meeting here in 2016. And we see this conference of the same stature as those conferences. And again, we're really delighted to be able to host this event here. With that, I think we're going to just go ahead and get rolling. And again, we're going to work to stay very close to our time schedule. And so unless our speakers allow, we won't be taking questions after individual presentations unless we specifically have time to do that. These speakers will be around, and you will have time to ask them questions at different points in time. We have a break. We also have some cards that you should have where you're seated, and feel free to write your questions down, and Sandy and her team will be gathering those at different points in time. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, Dr. Jeff Stevenson. And I've known Jeff a long time. I probably can say that about most of the speakers here today, so I'll probably try to avoid that. But Jeff's a graduate of Utah State, Michigan State, North Carolina State University. He's been on the faculty here at Kansas State since 1980. Clearly been a leader in the areas of beef and dairy cattle reproduction. He's written a column in Horde's Dairyman since 1991. He's been recognized by American Dairy Science Association, National Association of Animal Breeders, American Society of Animal Science, both for their Physiology and Endocrinology Award and as a Fellow of the American Society of Animal Science. And Jeff's title of his presentation this morning to kick us off is Physiology of the Estrus Cycle. So with that, Jeff, please join me in welcoming Jeff Stevenson to the podium.
Thank you very much, Ken. It's a privilege and honor to be here today. I had an opportunity to speak at the very first meeting that was held here in 2002, and so it's a pleasure to be back and be invited to visit with you. My charge today is to talk a little bit about the estrus cycle, to give you a little bit of a review, and to hopefully set up some of the presentations that will follow. And I'm focusing mostly on the whys and hows of controlling estrus and ovulation. So if we look back in time at what's happened to reproductive physiology, we have to give great credit to what's happened with the use of transrectal ultrasonography, where we have an opportunity to look at follicles and follicle development. As you can see here, there's 3 different ovaries that have small, medium, and large-sized follicles. And we look down here in the right-hand corner, we're looking at a follicle we call a dominant follicle, which is a follicle that potentially could become a preovulatory follicle to produce an egg that can be fertilized after ovulation occurs. This is a blown-up slide showing you what one ovary would look like with multiple small follicles along the upper left-hand part of that ovary, and a nice 12-millimeter follicle, which is close to preovulatory size, depending on whether it's dairy or beef cattle. And then you can see a very nice corpus luteum right here. You'll recall from your learning about reproductive physiology, when a follicle ovulates and the oocyte or the egg is expelled into the infundibulum of the oviduct, that what's left behind becomes a corpus luteum. And you can see that this corpus luteum has a cavity, and that's basically filled with some blood and fluid. It'll eventually go away about day 12 to 14 of the cycle, but it's usually indicative of a early forming corpus luteum. You rarely see a cavity in a corpus luteum when you're doing pregnancy diagnosis out about 35 days, but once in a while you do see that. So what happens then is a cow comes into estrus or heat. That dominant follicle or preovulatory follicle is producing the hormone estrogen. And estrogen is what makes Bossy Ball, so to speak. It causes her to show symptoms of estrus, causes her to mount, and eventually she will stand in the presence of a bull or in the presence of other mounting females. And that's indicative that she is in her fertile period of her cycle, and she's in estrus. If inseminated appropriately or mated by the bull, she can conceive. What estrogen does is it triggers the release of luteinizing hormone, the purple line that you see there, and that's the hormone that's released from the pituitary gland that will induce ovulation in the beef cow in about 30 hours after the onset of estrus. Note that the peak in estrogen and the peak in LH are fairly closely associated, and it's that peak in LH that drives the process of ovulation, so the follicle will release the egg in about 30 hours. So what happens then to that follicle after ovulation, as I described earlier with the sonogram photo, it will develop into a corpus luteum. And so early in the estrus cycle, you see a corpus luteum that forms, and it's reddish colored there. That's the corpus hemorrhagicum. That's because there is some blood in that cavity, and eventually that will go away, and it will become a full-blown corpus luteum. And if you've seen corpus lutea that have been excised for reproductive tracts, they are very yellow in color. It reaches a maximal size about 10 to 12 days after ovulation, and then in the absence of a viable embryo, that corpus luteum will eventually regress in response to prostaglandin F2 alpha, which is released from the uterine endometrium and causes the demise or the death of the corpus luteum. That would lead then to the onset of another estrus period or heat period. Now, the purpose of prostaglandin obviously is to bring the cow to estrus again, and of course that will start a new estrus cycle. Here is shown what happens when we intervene in the estrus cycle and use gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or what we simply refer to as GnRH. GnRH is it can be administered at any time or any random stage of the estrus cycle. It will induce the release of luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that will cause ovulation. It'll peak in about 2 to 4 hours after a GnRH injection, and that will lead to ovulation in about 24 to 30 hours. And so the time period here from GnRH to ovulation is just a little bit shorter than it would be if we looked at the spontaneous LH surge that occurs here, being about 30 hours. GnRH can induce ovulation in about 24 to 30 hours. How effective is GnRH in the cycle? If we look at this slide here, we can see that there are different points of time during the estrus cycle when GnRH is successful in inducing ovulation. We're looking here at estrus here at day 0, and then estrus here again about day 20. What is shown here in the blue circles are what we'd refer to as waves of follicles that typically develop during the cycle. After estrus, a new wave of follicles will begin to form, and you can see as those follicles will grow. And eventually, one of these follicles is selected and becomes a dominant follicle. When it's dominant, it has the ability then to respond to GnRH, induced LH release, and it'll cause that follicle to ovulate. So you'll notice that early in the estrus cycle here, GnRH is not effective at all in inducing ovulation because the follicle is not mature enough to respond to that stimulus. Later in the cycle, you'll see here, it's more effective. There's a period of time it's a little bit less effective, and what happens here is that first dominant follicle is becoming atretic. It no longer is responsive to hormones, and it will eventually go away, so to speak, or become atretic. And a second follicular wave begins right here and usually produces the oocyte or the egg that will be ovulated after the next estrus. Along the bottom part of the slide, you'll notice that I'm showing you some data from the Missouri group that shows that 0% of cows will ovulate on day 2, 75% on day 5, 66% on day 9, 50% on day 13, and 58% on day 18. And that's based on staged days of the cycle when GnRH was given to beef cows. I'm not used to this mouse. Did I skip a slide? No. Okay. There we go. So let's look at a typical protocol that many of you probably used. We refer to this as the 7-day co-sync protocol. It includes the CEDAR, or the progesterone-releasing insert that's placed into the vagina. And let's talk about what happens here at the beginning of this protocol. What is the role of GnRH? Well, as I described to you earlier, GnRH will cause LH release, and that should cause ovulation. Depending upon the day of the cycle, it may be more or less successful. And of course, the other challenge is that we do have cows that are not cycling when we begin our protocol before AI. So we've got anestrus cows. These are cows that have not yet started to cycle. They've never formed a corpus luteum since calving, and potentially can respond to this GnRH injection to produce their first corpus luteum after calving. We also have cycling cows that are at different stages of the estrus cycle. As I said earlier, some of those may respond to that injection and form a corpus luteum. So we have cows that have a corpus luteum when we treat them with GnRH, at what I'll call GnRH1, that may form a second corpus luteum. We may have cows that have a corpus luteum that don't respond. So we could end up at the time of prostaglandin with cows that would have one corpus luteum, maybe 2 corpus lutea, And sometimes, if it's an anestrus cow that did not respond to GnRH1, she still does not have a corpus luteum at the time of prostaglandin. Now, if we look at the responsiveness in data from Atkins, and Mike Smith and Dave Patterson's group at Missouri, you can see here the response to GnRH when cows were treated with GnRH at what I call GnRH1. 50% of the cows across the estrus cycle would produce ovulation during the estrus cycle. So it was a forced intervention by using GnRH. 77% of those cows ovulated at the second GnRH injection, at the time of breeding or just before the time of breeding. And then what's interesting, if you look at these data here, cows that ovulated to the first GnRH injection, 83% ovulated to the second GnRH injection. If they failed to ovulate to the first GnRH injection, about 2/3 of them ovulated after the second GnRH injection just before breeding. Now, if we look at anestrus cows, in another study they demonstrated the following. About 36% of the anestrus cows would ovulate in response to GnRH1. 71% ovulated in response to GnRH2. If they look at the combination then, as we saw earlier with cycling cows, if a cow if she responded to GnRH1, 80% of the time she would ovulate after GnRH2. If she failed to respond to GnRH1, 66% of the time she would ovulate to GnRH2. You see, these are really quite similar here between cycling and anestrus cows. If they had a cedar incorporated into that program and responded to GnRH1, 73% of them also ovulated after GnRH2. If they failed to ovulate in response to GnRH1 in the presence of a cedar, 69% ovulated after GnRH2. So it's not perfect. We will have cows, when we give GnRH2, that will fail to ovulate to that stimulus. Now, let's talk a little bit about why we use progesterone or progestogens in some of these protocols. Here I'm illustrating the cedar, and you can see here that I'm asking the question, why progesterone? Well, we know if we go back into the 1970s that progesterone is important in a suckled beef cow because it does a couple of things. First of all, it seems to regulate, if I can use that word, regulate the uterus. Typically, if a cow ovulates in response to GnRH1 here, and there's no progestin produced, the corpus luteum maybe fails to form, or she's not been exposed to progesterone before that period of time, she'll have what we call a short cycle. So she'll ovulate, and about 8 to 9 to 10 days later, she'll come back into estrus. Those cows are fertile. They will, in fact, conceive. Dr. Kirchhoff showed that back in the 80s, that those cows will form a corpus luteum. They will conceive, but because the cycle's so short, that embryo doesn't have a chance to survive and establish pregnancy. For cycling cows, progesterone seems to be very important there in terms of having some kind of pro-fertility effect. But in both cases, in the presence of progesterone, we don't have cows coming into estrus in this period of time, this 7-day period of time, which is good because we're expecting them to come into estrus after prostaglandin, and that allows us to either breed at estrus or to have an opportunity to get those cows to conceive in response to a fixed time insemination. What happens to the corpus luteum if there is a corpus luteum during this period of time? If a cow is late in her cycle, and she would typically, the corpus luteum is due to regress according to its natural timing, it will still regress during that period of time. So it will spontaneously regress, and the cedar, the progesterone coming from the cedar, will keep that cow from expressing estrus. And that would only apply to cows that are really late in the cycle, whose CL should typically regress according to their own natural timing during that 7-day cedar exposure. Now, if you look at another protocol where we would use MGA, feeding MGA or progestin, This is a protocol where MGA is fed for 14 days, and then a period of time is left here for females to come into estrus, typically heifers, and then they come back with a prostaglandin and GnRH protocol here. Well, MGA is really important here because it also does similar things that the cedar progesterone will do. For peripubertal heifers and also for anestrus cows that are close to starting their estrus cycles, exposure to the progestin, MGA, will in fact cause some of those cows to cycle and to produce their first corpus luteum. If a cow is cycling, when she starts the progestin treatment, and I'm showing you here 6 different cows. So the blue box represents that 14 days of progestin treatment, and you can see here that we've got a cow that's about day 1 of her estrus cycle, about day 4, about day 6, day 9, day 11, day 13. So there's all at different stages of the cycle. They go on the progestin feeding treatment, and according to the natural timing of their own corpus luteum, it will regress. So you'll notice that these cows here that started between about day 6 and about day 13, their CL will regress during that 14-day feeding period of MGA. And those cows will not come to estrus because the progestin will prevent estrus from occurring, but will come into estrus after the feeding is ended and MGA clears from the blood supply. We have cows here that are early in the cycle, as these top 2 cows. In these cases, their corpus luteum is just either starting to regress or will regress shortly after the feeding period ends. So what happens to fertility is the cows whose corpus luteum was maintained throughout the progestin feeding period and regresses as that feeding period ends or just afterwards, those cows or heifers will have normal fertility. In contrast, the heifers or cows whose CL regress during the period of MGA feeding, they will have very poor fertility. Because what happens in these cows is that follicle we have a dominant follicle that continues to develop during that period of time, and it becomes what we call an aged follicle, if you will. And those cows will produce an oocyte that's fertile, but it dies in the first several days of embryo development. And so that's why in this protocol, this 19-day period here is a period for those animals to come to estrus, but we don't breed them because most of them will be very poorly fertile. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what happens when prostaglandin is given. The purpose of that prostaglandin treatment is to regress any luteal tissue that's there, whether it's the single corpus luteum that formed in an anestrus cow, or it's a single corpus luteum in a cycling cow that had a CL at the time we started, at the time GnRH1 was given, and she didn't ovulate and form a second corpus luteum, or we have a cow sometimes that has 2 corpolutea. And the purpose of that prostaglandin is to cause that luteal tissue to regress so those cows or heifers will come into estrus. And so the role of prostaglandin is very important. If it doesn't work properly, then there's no way that those animals will be fertile to a timed insemination. And if it doesn't work at all, if we're doing estrus detection, those cows will not likely come into estrus unless they were close to the end of their cycle when the cedar was removed and prostaglandin was given. So how effective is prostaglandin? I'm showing you in this slide, first of all, we're looking at the blue shaded area represents progesterone concentrations during the estrus cycle. So day 0 here would be estrus, day 21 would be the next estrus, and blue represents the corpus luteum function secreting progesterone during that cycle. The red line represents a first wave of follicles that develop in the early part of the cycle, and the yellow line represents the second wave of follicles that we looked at earlier. The black bars here represent the luteolytic success when we give an injection of prostaglandin to cows. And you'll notice here that typically early in the cycle there's an increase in the luteolytic success of prostaglandin. It really doesn't reach its optimum or maximal ability to regress the corpus luteum until we get out here about day 12 of the estrus cycle. I've circled this area right here in red because this is the problematic CL regression group. These would be cows on a protocol that would have a new young corpus luteum that formed after GnRH1. So they would be either, that corpus luteum could be 5, 6 days old. And you can see based on a spontaneous cycle that the regression success is relatively small, or it's relatively less in those early corpus. And so those are problematic. Those would be cows that we may have difficulty in regressing the corpus luteum. Just to illustrate that, I'll show you these data. They actually come from dairy cattle, but they illustrate the point I just made. What we're looking at here is the age and the number of corpus or CL at the time of prostaglandin treatment that was 7 days after GnRH1. Okay? And then we're looking at the proportion of cows with CL regression after a single prostaglandin injection was given. So the first category here, these would represent cows that did not have a corpus luteum at the time of GnRH1. They ovulated in response to GnRH1, formed that corpus luteum, and they fall in that problematic group. They're the cows or heifers that have CLs that are 5 or 6 days old. You can see here, if a single injection of prostaglandin is given, only 64% of those corpus lutea responded, regressed, and allowed the cow to come into estrus. If a cow had an original CL, that is, she had a corpus luteum at the time of GnRH1, and she did not ovulate, so she just maintained that corpus luteum, 97% of those CL will regress in response to a single prostaglandin injection. But this is what's really interesting. If a cow had a corpus luteum at GnRH1 and we induced a new CL, so now she's got an old original CL and a new young CL, the regression of those two corpus lutea is in the 90% range, which tells us that when that mature corpus luteum starts to regress, it's going to cause the demise of a younger CL as well. And there's lots of biology we can get into that, but that's what's really neat about it. If you do have 2 CL, usually that young CL is going to go away at a very high percentage rate, and that's because there's an older CL that's going to go down too in response to prostaglandin. So what happens now if we're going to detect estrus? And we've talked about follicle waves. We've talked about whether follicles can respond to GnRH or not. What happens to when cows come into estrus? What determines the length of time from giving prostaglandin to when they come into estrus? If we look at a normal estrus cycle, as illustrated here, where the corpus luteum would typically begin regression about day 18 or 19 of the cycle, generally that cow is going to come into a spontaneous estrus or heat in about 3 days. And that's because we have a follicle there, a dominant follicle that would result generally from a second follicular wave that's mature in size, it's capable of responding to LH eventually and ovulate. And so those cows are going to come into estrus in about 3 days. That's typical for a 21-day cycle for a heifer or a cow. But what would happen then if we gave prostaglandin early in the cycle, say about day 8 or 9 as illustrated here? Well, you can see there we have a nice follicle, a nice follicle size that's there. That would be the first wave dominant cycle, the first wave dominant follicle. And that prostaglandin injection would cause luteal regression, causes progesterone to go down to basal levels. And because we have a nice mature follicle there, it's going to ovulate fairly quickly. And so we have a very short interval to estrus. Oftentimes those cows or heifers will be in estrus in 36 to 48 hours. And that resets everything. That follicle goes ahead and ovulates, as illustrated here. And now, where we had day 12 before, what would have been day 12, we have reset the estrus cycle to day 0 again. And so now we've reset the cycle. The cow is beginning a new cycle. She starts to develop a new follicular wave, and we have short-cycled the cow, so to speak. So we have a very short interval to estrus here because we had a dominant follicle that was responsive and ready to go. Now, what would happen if we gave prostaglandin about day 11 or 12? And you can see from the red circles, now that first wave dominant follicle is starting to become atretic, and we're seeing a new second wave follicle begin to develop. Now, that second wave dominant follicle is really small, and it's unable to produce enough estrogen. It's not mature, and so it's going to take time for that event to occur. Furthermore, this first wave dominant follicle is unrescuable. It cannot be rescued. It's already begun atresia, and it's going away. So the cow has to wait, so to speak, for that second wave dominant follicle to become large enough here to produce enough estrogen to bring her in estrus. And so this interval from prostaglandin to estrus is going to be about 5 days. And so typically, if some of you are old like I am, you go back in time for the very early data with prostaglandin. What we saw is that the typical response to prostaglandin is we see cows coming into estrus between 0 and 5 days. 0 and 1 day cows, those cows that come in right away, their corpus luteum was regressing spontaneously, so the prostaglandin wasn't needed there. But most of the cows that came in were between days 2 and 5. 2-day cows would be those cows like my first illustration. The 5-day cows is like this illustration here, where we're between follicular waves. And so if there's not a follicle there ready to produce enough estrogen and mature enough, those cows are going to take longer to come to estrus than those that have a follicle that's ready to go. So you can see that the cycle's been reset again here. Instead of day 16, where now estrus occurs on her old clock, it's now reset to day 0, and she starts a new cycle. So what about G2? We've talked how it's important in ovulation. Generally, in a lot of the protocols, we give GnRH2 and we breed the cow at the same time. There is one data set, if you go back to Tom Geary's work at Colorado State, where they compared the co-sync, what they were calling co-sync then, where they gave, there's only 48 hours here between prostaglandin and when GnRH2 was given and AI occurred. And then they compared it to a group of cows that they called off-sync 48, where they gave GnRH on day 9 and bred the cows 24 hours later. You can see that the pregnancy rates are the same. They also did calf removal there, and the cows from whom the calves were removed for 48 hours actually had about 9 points better fertility than the cows that didn't have their calves removed. But it tended to only work well in older cows, where the calf removal had a more positive effect. Now, we just did an experiment here, and this is only one small data set. There's more cows that will be added to this study, where we compared typical co-sync that we've talked about earlier. The difference is if we put patches on these cows, if the patches were activated, we did not give the second dose of GnRH. If the patches were not activated at 66 hours, we gave GnRH at the time we bred the cows. The other group, we gave GnRH at 48 hours, regardless of what the patches looked like, whether they're activated or not, and we bred those cows 18 hours later. And these are the results. At 48 hours after prostaglandin, we only had about a fourth of the cows in estrus already. Okay? By 66 hours, 64% of the cows in the co-sync group were in estrus, only 43% in the off-sync group. Why is that? Because when we gave this GnRH injection at 48 hours, it suppresses estrus. But look at the fertility here. If cows came into estrus by 66 hours, we had close to 60% fertility to the time insemination. This is what's interesting. The cows that did not come into heat in the co-sync group that got GnRH at the time they were inseminated at 66 hours, fertility was 7%. And it was 25% in the cows that actually received GnRH earlier on. So to summarize what we've talked about today, progesterone is required to regulate the postpartum uterus to prevent short estrous cycles. And that's why in MGA protocols or CEDAR protocols, progestin or progesterone is really important. We know that GnRH can induce ovulation. It's not perfect, about 50 to 75% of the time in cycling cows and 36% in anestrus cows. We know that complete corpus luteum regression is age dependent. Okay, it depends on the age of the corpus luteum, and the presence and the maturity of a dominant follicle really determines when estrus occurs after CL regression. So I thank you for your attention.
Jeff, thank you very much. We have a speaker's gift we'd like to provide to you. Thank you. And we're going to go ahead and stay on time. Our next speaker is Dr. Dave Patterson. Dr. Patterson, many of you obviously know. Dave is a graduate of Montana State, a PhD at Kansas State, started his academic career at University of Kentucky, moved to the University of Missouri, where he's had a very successful career as both a research scientist and an extension specialist. He's had evidence of his stature as a scientist. He's had funding from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture's Competitive Grants Program. He's the developer and leader of the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer Program in Missouri. He's received several awards, including a recipient of the American Society of Animal Science Extension, an Animal Industry Service Award, and the Beef Improvement Federation Continuing Service Award. Dave is certainly a leader in this organization, has certainly been a leader in beef cattle reproduction, and please join me in welcoming Patterson.
Can everybody hear okay? Well, I'd like to thank Sandy and the organizing committee here at K-State for the invitation to participate in this workshop. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributors to this presentation, in large part my graduate students, who I've just had a tremendous group of students over the years. In this particular case, Jordan Thomas, Cameron Locke, Brianne Bishop, Jill Abel, and Emma Nickmeyer. And then my close friend and colleague, Dr. Mike Smith, who was unable to attend this conference. So if we go back, as Jeff discussed, the development of these synchronization protocols have occurred over a number of years, going back to the 50s and 60s, with more or less the understanding that progesterone was key relative to inhibiting both estrus and ovulation and essentially creating a prolonged luteal phase. As you move through this slide, basically you can see over the course of those decades, we're currently in a place where, based on our understanding of better methods in terms of estrus cycle control, we're using combinations of products that include progestins, GnRH, and prostaglandin, as Jeff pointed out. Our Beef Reproduction Task Force, working with the leadership team, has been, I think, very effective in terms of simplifying these protocols for use by the industry. And as all of you are aware, these protocols are published in each year in the backs of all the AI stud books. The point that I would make relative to this slide is the fact that whenever you pick up a book, make sure, and are getting ready to set up your sync programs for a given year, make sure that you use the current year's recommendation. Because if you pull out one of these books from 4, 5, 6 years ago, you may be working with outdated information. What's really changed the industry, I think, in large measure is the development of these timed AI protocols, both for beef heifers and cows, and we'll be talking more about these as we move through the presentation. But these protocol sheets first were approved in 2004 in our meeting in North Platte, and they were first published in the Bull Books in 2005. But as you can see, more or less over the course of time in the various categories that include heat detection, and time AI, and the fixed time AI protocols, we've made some changes and additions in terms of better methods or expanded methods of estrus cycle control, which fit into each of those various categories. What that's culminated in is if you go back to 2005 and see where beef semen sales in the United States were at, and what's occurred subsequent to that, we see a significant increase in the volume of beef semen sales in the United States. And I would argue that in large measure, a lot of that has occurred as a result of these and application and administration of these time protocols. So I think one of the goals of our task force and the goals of the leadership team in general when we talk about development of these protocols over time is first that they be easy to schedule and administer, that they reduce animal handling. But I think a key contributor here is the fact that we've all of our various research programs have placed very high emphasis on trying to identify protocols that result in a fairly highly synchronized and fertile estrus accompanied with ovulation. So the next few minutes, basically what I want to do is provide an overview of the protocols available for heifers, some recent work that we've been involved with Jill Abel's work with 2-year-old cows, focus then on the mature cows, and then a more recent concept that we've worked with as well as the group here at K-State on split time AI. So to begin with, in terms of the timed AI protocols for heifers, you can see from your protocol sheets that there's basically 4 protocols that are recommended, 2 short-term and 2 long-term. And I think by far and away, probably the bulk of the industry is used the longer-term protocols, and so I want to begin the discussion there. Jeff talked about the MGA protocol, and Dr. Odie's group, when he was back at Colorado State, was really the pioneer in the 80s in terms of development of this protocol. There were a number of institutions, several that were involved with development of the MGA-based protocols. Our group here at K-State, when I was a student, we were working with a 7-day protocol. But the protocol that really emerged was the 14-day MGA prostaglandin protocol, and originally it was a 17-day interval, and more recent work by Cliff Lamb and Gene Deitcher really indicated that you might perhaps benefit by an extension of 2 additional days, at which time prostaglandin is administered after MGA withdrawal. We worked with sort of an offshoot of that, substituting MGA with the cedar, and in this case, and I'll point to the reasons as to why, that interval is a 16-day interval between cedar removal and prostaglandin. What we were interested in doing, we placed a very high emphasis in terms of use of heat watch, in terms of characterizing estrus expression with these various protocols. And if you look at the interval to estrus among MGA-treated heifers versus cedar-treated heifers coming off those 2 progestins, basically you can see that this is what occurs. There's a significant difference in that variance for interval to estrus comparing the 2 treatment groups, and you see a much more robust interval expression of estrus over a shortened period of time among the cedar-treated compared to the MGA-treated heifers. This, in large measure, is simply a result of how those 2 products clear the animal's system, allowing them to express estrus following either withdrawal or removal. This, then, is a characterization of the distribution of estrus after prostaglandin. Again, this is heat watch data. The black bars represent the MGA-treated heifers. The gray bars represent the cedar-treated heifers. And although these profiles look similar to one another, there is a significant difference in that variance for interval to estrus, which more or less points to the fact that the degree of synchrony is improved among the cedar versus the MGA-treated heifers. When you carry that then to a timed AI setting, then the work that's been done would indicate that with MGA, the appointment breeding would be performed at 72 hours following the administration of prostaglandin in conjunction with GnRH administration. And in the case of the cedar, that interval is 66 hours following prostaglandin. Again, GnRH is administered at that time. Without going into all the data behind that, if we boil it down, basically the work that our group was involved with looking at inseminations performed on the basis of observed estrus, and again, this was heat watch data that we've really found no differences in synchronized conception or pregnancy rates between the MGA or cedar-treated groups. And Rick Funston's group at the University of Nebraska, putting the 2 head-to-head in terms of a timed AI setting, really found no differences. The key point relative to MGA is intake, and if you can assure adequate intake on a daily basis, it works very effectively. Want to move now to the short-term protocols, and Cliff Lamb, when he was at the University of Minnesota, really was key in terms of development of these protocols in terms of the short-term protocols, both for heifers and cows. And the initial study, which involved roughly about 500 heifers per treatment group, so it was a fairly significant study in terms of the scope of it as far as animal numbers. The two protocols on the top basically involved a combination of estrus detection and timed AI, in which case, following cedar removal and prostaglandin, the heifers were heat detected and inseminated on the basis of heat up to the point of 84 hours, at which time any of the non-estrus heifers were appointment inseminated with GnRH administered at that time. The only difference being, as you can see here, is whether or not GnRH was administered at cedar insertion. The bottom two protocols indicate that the heifers were inseminated in those two treatment groups by appointment at 60 hours after cedar removal and prostaglandin. And again, the only difference being whether or not GnRH was administered at the time cedars were inserted. To boil that data down, and a lot of this information in terms of the actual numbers is in your proceedings, so I would refer you to those proceedings for the more detailed information. But the take-home here was that GnRH at cedar insertion did not improve pregnancy rates after timed AI. GnRH at cedar insertion did not alter the percentage of heifers detected in estrus or the distribution of estrus after prostaglandin. And more importantly, probably a combination of detecting estrus and AI before a cleanup AI actually enhanced pregnancy rates over timed AI. So more recently, the 5-day co-sync cedar protocol was developed by Mike Day and Alan Bridges. And basically, this protocol is very similar in its design to the 7-day, the only difference being the cedar is only inserted for a period of 5 days. And I think the thing here you need to understand is that when GnRH is administered at the time the cedar is inserted, as Jeff pointed out, you really cause the creation, or what results is the formation of an accessory corpus luteum. Because you're working with a 5-day interval versus a 7, that CL, that accessory CL, is not fully capable of responding to that initial injection of prostaglandin. So to fully lyse that luteal tissue, then essentially a second injection needs to be administered roughly about 8 hours following to enable those females then to exhibit estrus. And in this case, appointment breeding is performed at 60 hours after that initial injection of prostaglandin and cedar removal. So the comparisons relative to the treatment, those treatments, the 7-day versus the 5-day and the 14-day versus the 5-day, if you boil it down in terms of what's published in the literature, with roughly about 600 heifers involved in that field trial, the only significant difference was in the case of the comparison between the 5 and the 7-day protocols, with an advantage to, as you can see here, to the 5-day treated heifers. One of the questions I think all of us have to ask ourselves, and I think historically one of the problems we ran into in the industry, was many heifers were being synchronized that simply weren't ready to synchronize. And so I think that's one of the big points that we've used in our heifer program in Missouri. And I think, well, if you go back to the data into the 70s and talk about heifer management considerations in general, heifers that conceive earlier during their first breeding season, we know from data across the country, those heifers stay in the herd longer and they produce more pounds of beef over their lifetime. So in our program in Missouri, basically we place very heavy emphasis on that. So we have a comprehensive database, and all the heifers are track scored in our program. And there is a pre-breeding exam that involves both the track scores as well as the pelvics. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the track scoring system, to me it's a very underutilized tool in terms of reproductive management. The scores range from 1 to 5, 1 being an infantile reproductive tract, 2s being heifers that are really greater than about a month from reaching puberty. Scores of 3 indicate they're within a month of cyclicity onset, and scores of 4 and 5 indicate that those heifers actually are estrus cycling, but simply at different stages of the estrus cycle. So a 4 would indicate that the heifer's in the follicular phase. A score of 5 would indicate that the heifer's in the luteal phase, in other words, roughly between days 6 and 16 of her cycle. So timing is a big deal, because if you get into these heifers too early, the scores are more or less going to be meaningless. But they should, based on timing, be performed about 4 to 6 weeks before breeding or 2 weeks before sync programs are administered. And in our data, which we have records on thousands of heifers, really the green light should go on when about half of those heifers are estrus cycling or assigned scores of 4 and 5. So I want to share with you some data from Missouri in terms of our heifer program. And this is, to me, somewhat of a unique data set because we have data from across the state. There's data in this slide showing the relationship between track score and fixed time AI. There's just shy of 30,000 heifers represented in this data set. And as you can see, the numbers of heifers that were exposed by the various track scores 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 163 ones, 893 twos, 8,400 threes, 10,000 fours, and 9,700 fives. You can see the more or less stair-step increase in pregnancy rates or results as a result of those various track score assignments. We also have the opportunity to really look at what's happening relative to how these heifers are performing based on the various protocols. So the protocols that are being used most extensively in our program are the 7-day co-sync cedar, MGA prostaglandin, and the 14-day cedar. And if we eliminate the ones, because by far and away most of the heifers that are assigned to track score 1 in our program, and you can see based on that abysmal performance in terms of breeding following fixed time AI on that first slide, most of those heifers are eliminated before the breeding season. But if you boil the data down here in terms of the 2s and 3s, 9,300 heifers, 38% of the 7-day treated heifers became pregnant, 35% of the MGA prostaglandin treated heifers became pregnant, and 47% of the 14-day cedar treated heifers. If you look then at the cycling heifers, 43, 47, and 52, and then if you collapse those numbers and combine them, basically there are significant differences with the advantage to the longer-term treatment. What you do see is a significantly higher number of heifers going on the 14-day protocol. That in measure, I would to the fact that veterinarians, because the veterinarians in our program closely to the program, they're finding steps. So the exams formed time the seed in many cases, and it also affords them the opportunity to administer pre-breeding booster vaccinations. So it's more or less a one-stop shop. So the take-home points for heifers protocols we're choosing a per heifers in terms of AI valuable to assess or to use prior to a treatment administration as a track scoring system, and we'll talk more about that in the labs tomorrow. And timing is an important consideration with regard to that. Protocol compliance is huge. We're getting more calls, all of us involved in use of these protocols, both in terms of product administration and timing of insemination. So I want to quickly turn to a discussion about 2-year-olds. And we were interested in looking at comparison of how the long and the short-term cedar-based protocols compare in 2-year-olds. So a head-to-head comparison was done where we looked at the 14-day cedar, in which case timed AI was performed at 72 hours after prostaglandin versus 66 hours in heifers. And that was compared to the standard co-sync cedar protocol, in which case timed AI was performed at 66 hours following prostaglandin. So we had the opportunity to work with University Herd in Missouri at the Thompson Research Center, and then worked with 2 large operations in southwest Montana to get into groups of where we had to teach this large 2-year-old. First, all these females had patches at the gland and was so estrus up to the point time AI. And first thing we saw was a significant difference in these 2 that express up to the fixed time AI. 43% 14-day cows versus 4% of the day treated cows. We look at the pregnancy rates, really no 3 and 4% of the cows became to the breeding. And if we look at the performance in general of these 2-year-olds, which I thought was exceptional, 80 and 88 were pregnant with the first 30 breedings, and 95, 6% pregnant out of a 6 breeding season. The point that really caught attention with that we've done longer protocol in the fact that we see acceptable pregnancy rate, comparable pregnancy rates, 7-day protocol, and of lower response. And work that's involved actually did sampling both prostaglandin and time AI was formed. And the thing that we found, which in our hands is the comparability differences, the relations we see between short and the long protocols, and the fact that the L concentrations on those protocols that were the 14-day protocol were at double what they were the 7-day cows. So the conclusions from that is the 14 and the 7-day calls were actively in both. In both is the take home though is the suggestions are powerful and so they're used in reproductive in general. So now talking about cows, I've talked a little about this from the standpoint of Esther and the opportunity to test cyclicity using track scoring for. But one of the things on the CAD we have to understand is if you look at the yellow, the line here, that's more what it is as CAD turned to following CAD. 90% post-partum cows experience short rise in testosterone, which will follow by short luteal in a normal testosterone pattern. We mimic that rise in progesterone very effectively with either change to CAD, as he in his presentation have followed that are large enough size to affect induced ovulation, or we can substitute that with the application of the cedar. So if we look at some data from our group, some of my former graduate students, and look at fixed-time pregnancy rate cows were ancestral cycling, these were published over 300 cows, and if you get all cows were below 10-day before treatment initiated, the day they were initiated, 57 of those 23 cows were seeing treatment initiated, 43 were not. And if you look at day rates in which all these cows have been bred, essentially known. And so this speaks of the utility of these products in terms of reproductive management. So now on to fix AI consistency between the 5 protocol. We were interested in comparing the two head, and Deep's group was also involved in comparison, which is shown in this. But this treated cows, Missouri, Wilson was involved with this particular trial, and the illustrated blue bar represent the cows, the six-colored bar represent the cows that were in Virginia Tech. About 200 cows per treatment in Missouri. You can see that pregnancy rates were identical in terms of fixed-time preg rate, 87% cases. There was with low numbers in Virginia, 900 per treat, 3% point advantage cows that were into the 5 call. For the cow 7-day group, as you can see, we're in 7 day 69 versus 6 hours. The protocol is on the in Missouri in 7 days were 7 cows on 3 herds, 8, which in itself is so small. Making, as you can hear, we have 62% on terms of fixed AI at these locations. 7 were under 50%, and case by case, we can perhaps point indicators as to why those may have more than what we see. Sandy Jung compared or looked at compilation studies with the protocol, and both protocols formed very quickly, I think. Considering comparison of the, I think you have to refer to what are your data where there was a slight advantage 5-day protocol, but you need to consider the associated risks in labor and cost administration. So the take-home cows that work, choosing a protocol for cow, you need to consider the cow average number of postpartum sleep body, but a compliance again is a consideration in terms of administration and timing elimination. I want to with kind of a discussion of this concept of time AI. Higher pregnancy achieved with time AI. We consider fertility and time AI program among males that exist prior to AI. We clearly understand that there are differences in when males exhibit or express receptive time data. So a lot of that laid in gestation. There's also differing from estrogen ovulation. All cows read this book and determine they're going to offer relative to estrogen. Among the that don't exist prior to timed AI, we do know that GnRH induces the LH surge within 2 to 4 hours after adaptation, and that oxygen will then induce roughly 4 to 3 hours after GnRH. We have to be thinking about what's occurring when administering products, like relationship cows expressing. Tom is really involved with the concept in terms of AI, based on occurring relative estrus and female fertility. Jeff pointed out that estradiol is important relative to expression. In general, we know cows that express estrus prior to have greater estradiol concentrations, and that pregnancy rate basically achieves those females who express estrus, being that age with the 2 years. So, Gordon's question was, is it worth considering a approach in which it can make time AI ability by differentially female based on estrogen fixed time AI? Good fertility perhaps improved by splitting AI time estrus and estrus female. The whole of this was initially based on trying to develop breeding strategies to facilitate expansion of sex women, with the idea that develop a strategy that would minimize female optimality by managing female don't express prior to the time in the fixed time AI breeding. The hypothesis was that by taking insemination of the non-females 24 hours after GH, that would actually improve fertility, better align the window of sperm for ovulation. So Jordan's 3 with 3 tells all the published now looking at split time optimized sex-sorted split time and convention in both heifer and calf. The point relative to actually implementing split time is to have some way to evaluate estrogen or so in all of this we apply check patch time process administer those patch in red pointed time. So the cow protocols they're all on the 7 plus protocol, and you see here just cows inseminated GnRH 66 hours. The modification for the non-cows, they receive GnRH 6 hours, insemination postponed 2 hours. The same held true relative to mechanic offers. In this case, however, all assigned to the 4-day cedar call. So the from that first were the time actually in pregnancy by 30% among the first cows inseminated with semen, split AI and pregnancy rates 15% among the non-having convention, but we saw this particular study anyway improvement of cows. So Bishop program and asked the next question was does GnRH affect response in pregnancy following time AI? I think when work that Breen was involved in, again, a lot of data is proceedings have to go through actual numbers. What that data is that not necessarily administer to have cows that access for 66 hours after the gland, and the treatments that we utilize in studies to make a point, the 14 protocol heifers in the protocol cows, GH may be concurrent for heifer cows that fit express estradiol 90 hours. As you can see here, it minimize the use in these. So this is really what we're doing. As you can see on the 4 days treaters, the estrus are in 66 after process, no GnRH. The non-heifers are for 20 to 24 hours, and GnRH only administered to those that have to exhibit. This holds true for. So where do we go here? I think in terms of research, in terms of the cow herd, and just need more was indicated. We developed strategies. I think continued on the sex semen side. Also need to be considering at relative to. I think in terms of technology, the thing that I would encourage all of you is to visit and post. I think we need more students with a lot of. So that I'm going to include and thank a number of guests. We don't have to thank now. Appreciate your time, and we'll be over the course of the days.
Thanks, Dave. Next program, we have Dr. Funston, and Rick is from North State, Montana, PA University of Wyoming. I've crossed with Rick. He was a postdoc at Ohio State a number of years ago. He's been faculty at Nebraska, located in North Platte. A lot of work in cattle reproduction, also in beef cattle systems program, and has become a leader in the area of cattle reproduction and beef cattle maintenance as well. So, please join me in welcoming Rick Funston.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Ottawa. I do have the privilege of being located off campus in the heart of the industry at North Platte, Nebraska. There's a lot of things going on in Nebraska in the beef cattle industry that aren't in parts of the country. And expansion, if you will, largest feedlot, large meat production, more acres in the United States, corn and now, and we have a location where we have been research conducted. The one up in the center of the there is the Goodman Sandhills Laboratory, which is our largest beef facility. We also have elk and we just a little bit different, but that was picture taken 5 miles from house near Hershey, Nebraska. Another site or so ago, Eclipse was a location up in western Nebraska that some out-of-state person thought would be great to epitomize the Stonehenge with cars. But the Sandhills of Nebraska are very full of cows, more cows than people in the state. The largest cow-calf county just to the north of the red star, if you will, is more cows and calves than any county in the United States, which is Cherry County. And the Sandhills, a mixture of upland sand dunes and sub-irrigated meadows. This is the Goodmanson Sandhills Laboratory. We had our field day last week and had over 300 people there. So, other thing that's a little hard to get used to coming from North Dakota, some of the climate variation in the state that we didn't have in North Dakota, and we're all looking forward to next weekend, and we'll see how that gets started. And I know you all from K-State are as well, right? But a lot of work in beef systems research, looking at relevant questions to producers, but understanding how those short-term decisions can impact lifelong productivity in steers and heifers. And I won't cover a lot of that. I've been asked to talk about why do these protocols work, or what are factors that influence the success of these protocols, and why do we even implement them? One of the things going on in the beef industry is a lot of discussion about efficiency. And this slide actually comes from an animal breeder and points out how important reproduction is to our system, and says that by simply increasing number of progeny per dam through either selection, heterosis from crossing, or better management will increase efficiency of production. It's a numbers deal. I don't care how a calf's going to grade at slaughter if I don't have a live calf born every year. So the most important trait is reproduction, but I would say one of the most important factors of reproduction is when animals conceive. And if we look at steer progeny from the Goodmanson Ranch, we see that those calves born early are heavier, clear to slaughter, and grade better. The heifers also are heavier, clear to breeding. They breed better. They conceive earlier, wean a heavier calf, and also breed back sooner. Mike Smith summarized this data, but a weaning weight, hot carcass weight, marbling score, average choice or better, and carcass value all improved those old calves. Weaning to the heterogeny, breeding, calving, or cycle pregnancy were all in the heterogeny that were born in cycle. Probably significant consequence here, consistent in calves that those animals have longer period to read after having their calf, and hence that they'll open much less than if they calve late in the calving season. Harlan Hughes, who was an economist at NDSU when I was an undergrad, he said it takes a profit from two or having cows over the loss on late cow that can first entire life produce more calf. Now, Cushman and Dave alluded to this, that those that conserve earlier in their have great longevity. And this isn't completely explained by the age of the female. Some of the younger have to conceive either. They will wean essentially two more calves in their lives as well. So the first is very, very good to the longevity as they're out of the females. So how do we influence that? Well, they've just gave very protocol synchronization AI. This was in the Badlands of Western North Dakota, showing facilities AI program. But some of the time and protocols, I would argue, probably only this one. We don't need to use it to produce all these protocol sheets. I think in those long-term protocols better than anything that's had a 7-day sync just pretty well. Would point out here from the hair here in a little while that large MD 14 seaters probably the largest one I'm aware of was in from Larry as well. Implemented their ran, found no difference in those protocols. I think a key is like getting him into those animals. We heard about NHS getting those animals with some of the gestation and pregnancy in a shorter period of time. Earlier, consent calving. Harlan Hughes had opportunities in our resident cow to use profit and moving later calving males up, and already showed data we can estrus males just as well as those that are cycling. And I've produced that routine now. We'll take calving cows, cedars for 7, pull it, give us the gland, and just the bulls, and routine seeing time of pregnant by 2 to 3 estrus sites. Pretty powerful tool. I think some to consider, especially when we look at how pounds half there are per day. If we cow up a cycle, that's 4 months more for the investment of a cedar. So we're going to ask you to test. There are formulas that will tell us very well what type of pregnancy rate we should expect. It depends on how well we do just detention and function of conception rate times just detention rate and result in pregnancy. So we, if any of those are low, and we might expect our pregnancies are compromised. And I think a lot of our AI calls do just as well as the protocols with estrus detection. Jeff did this well, and Dave, well, let's get are they cycling? If we then ask to any of these issues, and we overcome this with synchronization protocol, some we can, some we cannot. Disease will be covered later, obviously, is one that we come, and we can have discussion on John Hall present our talk today, heifer development. Now probably prepared to only about half of it, right? There's difference there. There's a more intensive run a cow or come up and feed them a lot. Them all pregnant. It's another for later. How far a cow is postpartum, their body condition, and how many are cycling. Just observe those cattle on any day to see how many are potentially cycling before implementation. It might give you a clue what protocols to implement. Well, if we believe this data that has some age on it now, that provided cattle are cycling and candidate that we could not circumvent with a example that when we disseminated their national service AI had most of them fertilized, we lose 30% or more of the materials be paid for. So that's not what I want to focus on. And there'll be entire and some of the components just going to done some of these that go along. There are four categories of embryo loss. There's a genetic component. There's a lot of genetic defects. We're never going to find why. It resolves early embryo mortality. We're never going to find that in early care or DD, whatever we've by excessive inbreeding, line breeding works, something like that. Nobody wants to, but environment cover that. Different things. Post nutrition is important. To change nutrition, I would also show you here in a second. The change nutrition from time of age until day 50 is really critical to the success of any AI or natural service breeding program. And then there are numerous miscellaneous will be talked about throughout the program as well that affect the embryo losses. Here's some work did developers on corn resid versus in dry lot. Now both the dry lot are light of you, and what you see as far as rates AI, those heifers are better than the ones that were developed and confined. And why is that? So if we look at those heifers developed corn resid, they gained a pound, and they were a pound of a 30%. So in the dry weren't pushed excessively, pound and a half a day. They were synchronized together in the same pen out in the same pasture, and when we pulled them back into ultrasound about 40 days later to identify the AI pregnant heifers, those that were previously on resident gained the heifers that were locked up. Pound a day, and they were raising side. And this is key to the extent of pregnancy. They weren't being offered any additional nutrient, but they responded differently to that environment on their pre-grazing experience and what their body was. So parts compensatory gain, but was completed study mimicking this gain, the dry lot area, and then heifers to post breeding, and those heifers developed in a dry on a slated winter forage gain of their winter grass corn did not remain the same. Their pregnancy rates the same. Their gain was not the same. There's a real that knocking these heifers up, working away from them. And there's a lot learned going on about what we can do to optimize our response to AI based on both behavior and compensatory gain. A lot of work done after that established magical herds of weight and heifers get was pattern of to get this, and basically demonstrate that you could do any pattern, but there might be some advantages of a lower gain and then those ends up going breeding, showing first serve inception in the late heifers were restricted for a period and up into breed. We had first conception knows that we're just steady from weaning to pregnancy or tilling. And those numbers developed in that high, which tells me they restrict quantity and quality of all our work and quality. Those have actually greater longevity, that they provided a nutrition base similar to what they were going to be expected on as a go. We've big ranch that I worked in South Nebraska based on that we did our later cows. We didn't these calves until they came on corners, and he says it's the cheapest way in background half. Those heifers actually had a pregnancy. We've traditionally did a work in looking time of calving. We have a March and a May herd, and one of the interesting things is that the Shelby Coast row here, those born heifers have a 20 to 30% higher pregnancy rate than born later. People, as well as heat, is humidity, not in those, because cows breed anything basically in time. We're working on why these younger, higher risk females' pregnancy rates are significantly lower, and working at using intervention management strategies to try to provide a greater nutrient environment during these breeding seasons, because these younger females, I believe, they physically just can't eat enough to meet their nutrient requirements. It's not for quantity issue, it's quality. This is work Cliff did in Minnesota, looking at body and how it impacted subsequent cycling activity, made have either a 7 or 5, restricted them, they quit cycling, and then refed them and found those fat heifers had a full condition score greater to cycling again. And I think that begs the question, what are we doing with these heifers? What are we doing for time productivity? Dan Anderson's going to talk here at lunch on the excessive nutrients that wasted in the cell seed stock animal. I think from a commercial standpoint, we really need to be cognizant of what we're doing to lifetime. Are we going to feel that needs to have a certain amount of body to ever cycle again? My good friend Patterson is from Montana, and he always taught me as a nutritionist, it's all about balance. You got to have balance of the nutrients. And there are cases where it appears to be a great environment. These, in this case, and this was close to where Troy lives, this rancher moved into the sandhills and had on the sandhill had two or three aided pigs, and found they had 4 pregnancy rates after high. Part of it was to the apparently great management to have great quality and quantity. They fertilizers feeding excess protein when there's enough energy, in some cases can have negative impacts on production. The other on nutrients and nutrition review effects of supplementation on reproduction. There was some early work done at mile 6 showing positive benefits in the thinner female, but overall there's a lot of work done in this, but it comes down to the fatty profile. It's not all just some overall management problems. There'll be a talk John Arthington will give on minerals, so I'm not going to spend any time on that, but just considering what's in the environment, but also what antagonists are in the environment, potentially can have an impact on pregnancy rates in cattle as well. And if I'm going to feed a supplement, I always recommend to include an ionophore for the benefits of the ionophore, which improves feed efficiency, but independent of other benefits, there are some positive effects on reproduction by increasing propionate, potentially glucose in the system, which could potentially affect our pregnancy rates in these cattle as well. So considering everything: protein, energy, minerals, vitamins, and what's in the water. And we in the Sandhills have some very good water, but in western North Dakota, where the oil industry exists, is very suspect for some trace minerals that could tie up other minerals important for reproduction. One area that we often don't consider is what's happened to that animal even before birth. And Kim Vanami is going to give a talk later on this topic, but I just wanted to point out some of our work. This all started asking a very relevant production question. How can we decrease input costs in a cow herd in the Sandhills? And one potential way is to just graze year-round. And we have systems where we graze year-round, and these cows get nothing but water. So in that case, this was the treatment. The red line was cattle that were provided just winter grass, or the yellow line, sorry. And the red line is with a protein supplement, a pound of a 30% supplement. And why did we make that decision to supplement? Well, it wasn't for future progeny performance at the time. It was whether that animal would breed back or not. And in 14 years of data now we have from sites like this, we should benefit supplementing that cow for the reason that we think we are, for her to become pregnant, whether it be AI or natural service or timing of pregnancy. And a lot of that, the key is what's happening from calving around April until breeding in June. There's a steep trajectory of those animals are gaining weight, right? So that compensatory gain, that flushing effect is helping with their reproduction. But subsequently, we've seen that those females, the heifer calves from the cows that were not supplemented, that were allowed to get in that lower body condition, are less fertile. And steer progeny, or lighter carcass weights, lower marbling scores, and all that data is in some past repro proceedings from here. So the consequences of nutrient restriction must be considered not only for the individual animal, but for Junior here, who's not even born yet. Some other things Mike Smith pointed out that we need to consider: where does the semen come from? In a lot of data in this data set shows that semen from one of the four major AI companies, they had a 61% conception rate. Only 3 were below 50%, but from Custom Collect, a full 10% lower and more below 50%. And we see this when we do big AI projects. One of the first projects I did when I came back to Nebraska actually was with Larry Rowden, and I said, "What's the deal with that number 2 sire?" He said, "Read the cane code." Turned out it was a Custom Collect sire, and I will admit that we have never seen that type of fluctuation in semen that comes from one of the major AI companies. If we place semen in the cervix, we expect 20% lower conception rates. This is all in the proceedings, but we all have seen a set of heifers that are set up and a storm moves in, and what do? Well, I think if we just move to a timed insemination program, we don't have to worry about it. But pre-breeding vaccinations, there's some discussion there. There's a proceedings paper in last year's meeting at Des Moines. But in naive cattle, giving pre-breeding vaccinations close to the time of insemination can have negative consequences. And there are veterinarians in here that can speak better to that than myself. And Marvin Large, who is at this program, has done a lot for the industry in providing us with a very, very effective tool to breed a lot of animals in a short period of time and to minimize stress, which is the next point. How can we stress an animal more than when we subject them to an AI program, unless we have to intervene in some capacity, as this was in northern Montana? But this leads to something I assume Ronaldo will talk about. But when do we move animals after we AI? Some older data at CSU says we do it right away or we have to wait 40 days. And that has to do with the sensitivity of the pregnancy to to disruption by prostaglandin. So the last thing I want to end on, something we don't talk about. There's a short section in the proceedings paper that talks about the selection of your sires potentially can have long-term effects on the success of your reproductive rate in your cow herd. And this is where the genetic change happens. It is in the sire, and especially on a commercial operation, that single female has very little genetic contribution compared to the sire's overall effect. So what do we consider with sire selection? Do you keep replacement heifers? How and when do you sell your calves? Understand EPDs and selection index, and understand and know what selection pressure on some of these indexes will do for mature size, for example. I'm a big proponent of at least a portion, and I agree with Burke Teichert, probably 2/3 of this beef industry should be a terminal system. And how much wasted resources do we have in our industry by breeding for keeping a 15% replacement rate? Sadly, a lot of the genetic decisions being made are terminal, but the cows are not being treated as such. If we consider reproductive traits, there are about 3 things genetically that are very favorable towards reproduction, and one is non-dystocia. Those heifers that don't have calving difficulty will breed back sooner, and time of intervention. Those heifers that are taken out of that stressful environment sooner, some work from Miles City, were shown to breed back sooner. If we look at the sire side on selection of heifers from bulls that have larger scrotal circumference, we see an advanced time of puberty. They reach puberty sooner. When is that going to be a problem? When is a heifer coming in pregnant on a cow going to be a problem? How many have ever had one? And that's precocious puberty, and it's the result of a couple things, but I can't help but think that this isn't involved, this steep genetic trend for scrotal circumference, and Matt Spangler argues also yearling weight. But milk is another one. If we do not change our resource environment and continually increase milk production and mature size, what's going to happen? We're going to create cattle that will fall out of the herd, right? And there's been a lot of discussion on the data from U.S. Mark. We've made all the major 7 breeds the same size. Physiologically, yearling weights are similar in the major 7 breeds. Some would argue that we haven't changed phenotype. There's someone to the south of here I've heard give talks that we have genetic trends like this, but our weaning weights haven't changed in 25 years. Well, I bred half of a herd up at Goodmanson, this will be the 3rd year now, to a terminal Sim Angus bull, and I increased carcass weight 100 pounds in 1 year. But we also finished the heifers as should have been because they were terminal. And we made a heifer calf the same size at slaughter as the steers, the conventional steers that we keep replacements out of the herd. If a producer was using Angus bulls with average EPD for milk, weaning weight, yearling weight in 98 to 2000, the same bulls today would be ranked in the bottom 5%. And Jim McGran, who I just saw a couple of weeks ago down at Texas A&M, he said the reproductive rate of the cow herd has not increased in the past 20 years and tended to decline in the past 10 years. We're not making what's contributing to that. And genetics, I believe, cannot be ignored. My good friend Larry Cora, I don't know if he's here today, but I saw him last night. He was a beef specialist here for a number of years. He said, thus as we strive to improve growth rate in the cattle industry and to make the commercial cow more efficient from the standpoint of utilizing nutrients, we must ensure that we do not deviate from the goal of maintaining an optimum level of reproductive efficiency. We got to have a fertile cow that will exist in her environment without excess inputs to allow her to breed every year. And part of that benefit can come from having a crossbred female. So there are a lot of things that influence estrus response and conception rate. Just to run through, if we consider an AI program, what are the major problems in retrospect, after we look and pregnancy check, cattle are not good candidates, and which are and which aren't, which would most benefit from intervention with progestin, protocol compliance, sire selection, semen handling facilities. What do we do with those cattle post-breeding? I think is one of the most important things that influence our successful AI program. So unlikely that the biological activity of the products is a problem. And as the research has shown, they're basically all effective. So focus on a high percent pregnant early. It starts with the heifer. Consider synchronization. And if we need to supplement some of these high-risk females in these later calving herds, or when nutrition is going to be declining post-breeding, that might be something that would help our program as well. Herd health, genetics that fit the environment, and heterosis. So with that, a lot of this is based on a paper that Mike Smith did in Joplin in 2010 that can be found at the beefrepro.info website. So thank you for your attention from the heart of the cattle industry and the heart of the Sandhills. 896 heifers on the Rex Ranch.
Join me in thanking Rick. Thank you very much. I'll set that one down. Lots of great information. Next on our program, we've Sandra Levering, ABS Global, is going to talk about characteristics of successful breeding programs and AI industry perspective. Sandra is a graduate of the University of Wyoming, has a master's degree at Kansas State University. Actually, if we would have been a little more on the ball at Colorado State, she might actually have had a degree from Colorado State, but that didn't happen. I like this statement she has here. She grew up in southeastern Wyoming where her mom did all the AI work when the ampule was used. And I will let you know that I bred my first cow with an ampule, so that probably dates me just a little bit. I suspect many of you probably haven't even seen ampules. She did do a master's at K-State, and she currently manages Kansas and southeastern Colorado and has a small area of south central Kansas with direct management and contact with beef producers working for ABS. So join me in welcoming Sandra.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Odie. I appreciate that a great deal. When we talk about, first of all, I want to lower your expectations. Keep in mind that I am the first speaker you've had today that does not have a doctor's degree, just have a master's degree, but a lot of experience, and that can be good or bad. Many of you in this room are qualified to give this talk. Many of you have had just as much experience as I've had. But just keep in mind, as you're developing an AI program, make sure you pick your team well, and the team needs to be accountable to your results. So as we go through some of these, some of you may not agree with some of it. Some of you may say, well, I want more information. You need to talk to your team, and that team needs to be your technician, your semen supplier, your veterinarian, your nutritionist, and yourselves and the people that are handling these cattle. So there's a lot of factors that play into that. What makes me qualified? First of all, rather than being a flower child, I'm a child of the ampule era. I grew up in a time period where we were still using the ampule. I didn't learn to AI until I came to K-State because my mom always did the work. But when I was in high school, I led a sheltered life, and I came to realize that the best drug going was Lutalize, because all of a sudden my heat checking went from a 21-day experience to a 10-day experience. So I thought that was the best drug in high school. And I've AI'd in a lot of different places, worked with a lot of different people. Keep in mind that in this business, you can be the hero or you can be the zero. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. So the big thing to keep in mind as you go through and develop your AI program is make sure that you've got a team that you trust and they're accountable to what goes on. And I've had a lot of opportunity to work with a lot of people over the years that have helped with my education and my experience. And lastly, I'm a jack of all trades, a master of none. So you'll have an opportunity to hear from a lot of experts over the next couple days that can offer a lot of insight into how we make this successful. I'm going to dial it back down to an equation of reproduction. You can't really get past this when you're trying to create a successful AI program. So keep in mind there's 4 factors that lie into how many cattle you're going to get bred or get pregnant via AI. It's a lowly heritable trait. Translation, there's no silver bullet. But the big thing is open communication with everybody that's involved, making sure everybody's accountable to what they need to do in this, and dedication by everybody involved. So when we talk about the first factor, it's herd members detected in heat or time bred and inseminated. And inseminator efficiency is the other part of that, the fertility of the herd. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the semen fertility levels. But keep in mind, it's kind of like that old show, The Weakest Link. The total cannot be larger than the weakest area of this. So you've got to take care of all four of those factors to make it work. So we talk about the first one, herd members detected in heat. And we've gone to a point in our business where we can do a lot of time insemination, but with that, you've got to make sure that those heifers are ovulating at a time period where you're putting the product in. So effective synchronization is key. You've got to make sure you're using products and protocols that are approved. You've got to make sure that you're providing the right dosage. And the administration of that is important. And when I talk about a team, I talked to my ABS reps yesterday in Kansas, and I said, okay, give me some ideas of what you think are important. And we had a 10-minute discussion on needle length. You know, and you look around at different facilities and different operations, the big part of that is making sure you get the product in. Whether you're using an 1.5-inch needle or you're using an inch needle and where you're giving it, the biggest part of that is making sure that product gets in the right place. The other part of it is the tails on the cedars. You know, if these cattle are in confinement and you're doing heifers, make sure you cut half of that tail off, because if they pull the cedar out, you're done. You've got to make sure that product stays in place. So making sure you take care of those little details, and that all comes from the team members working together to make that happen. If you're doing heat detection, make sure that you use tools to help you accomplish that, and make sure you apply them effectively so they're going to stay in place. There's nothing worse than walking out there and seeing a bunch of Estrotech patches laying on the ground. And then spend the time heat checking. Those people that think if you use those tools that you can spend 30 minutes in the morning and 30 minutes at night and do a good job with heat detection, I'm sorry, you're wrong. You've got to spend the time, because there's those ones when things are going fast and furious, there's those heifers that stand back and maybe they never get ridden, but they were in heat. So you've got to look at other signs. And the other part of it, we've got a great tool in the sync planner. Make sure you use that. Those people that sit and look at a calendar and they're counting back 31 days when they're going to go ahead and put the cedar in, you've got a tool, use it. So use that sync planner, and that helps with the communication as well. Inseminator efficiency. Making sure you're using a qualified technician, making sure they've got some experience, making sure they're knowledgeable in terms of what they're doing. But the other part of that, and this is probably the biggest part that I've seen success with my reps, is having a passion for what they're doing. We don't do this job because we like manure scattered or spattered all over us. We do it because we like to see the results and we like the opportunity to create differences. So making sure your technician has a passion for what they're doing, and the ability to complete the job in a timely manner without the fatigue, and making sure they can focus on what they're doing. And to go along with that, making sure there's enough help to be able to do it, and the ability to AI without getting tired or wore out. And, you know, we get into big projects, we'll rotate around, we'll take turns loading guns, just to make sure that we stay fresh and we stay on time. And then the facilities to keep everybody safe. I don't want to worry about somebody letting a cow in behind me when I'm AIing. And the use of the breeding barn has done a lot to help keep us safe when we're in there AIing, but along with that, it helps reduce the stress. So making sure that everybody stays safe. In terms of the fertility of the herd, and this one, as you can see, it's pretty long and involved, and I haven't even covered half of it. But proper cattle handling. When I go to places where they do a really good job handling the cattle, they don't stress the cattle, by the time you get to that AI, those cattle just flow through the system. They don't balk, they don't stand back, they don't fight you. So making sure that you take care of those things, making sure you handle the cattle properly, and using the right facilities. Dogs and hotshots are not my favorite co-workers in this situation, so keep that in mind. But there's a lot of work that's been done looking at how you can improve your cattle handling, and I would encourage you, if you're not doing that or haven't invested in looking at that you take that time. Rick talked a little bit about this, and there'll be more talk later on, the post-AI management related to transportation. Dr. Odie's grad students were involved in a large study done many years ago looking at getting those cattle, after you've AI'd them, getting them to where they're going to spend the next 30 to 45 days right away, within those first 5 days. So make sure you don't mess up all that work you've done by hauling those gals 15 days after you've AI'd them. Genetics, there are some breeds and some lines that are more fertile. We're still having a hard time identifying that. But keep in mind that heterosis is probably your best silver bullet in terms of improving this area. But we've got to be able to more accurately identify those, and we've got to relate it back to the environment. And that's the struggle we have in the beef industry over the dairy industry, because we've got a plethora, a variety of different environments that we have to work in, versus the dairy industry is pretty consistent. And you've got to make sure we're utilizing the technology that's out there to help us identify those things. Vaccinations, Dr. Sparrow, I'm sure, is going to address this in his next talk, but make sure you work with your local veterinarian to utilize the right vaccinations for your area. But the big thing is make sure you do it 30 days in advance of when the blessed event's going to occur. Nutrition, there's some basics there, but make sure they're on a gaining plane of nutrition. And just like Goldilocks porridge, make sure they're not too fat or too thin. I've had guys where I've done AI projects where they've been managed differently and they pull them together. And one guy's heifers were really fat, and I said, well, why are these so fat and the other one's thin? He goes, well, every time I drove by them, he said they get to bawling at me. I said, turn up the radio and keep going. Don't let your heifer dictate when you're going to breed them. You've got to make sure you're managing that properly. A good mineral program, John Arthington's going to talk about that. And then avoiding excess protein in the diet. And there's a lot of other factors that play into that, so that's why it's important for your nutritionist to be involved in your AI program. And then lastly, talking about semen fertility levels. And this is an area where I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done. When we're buying bulls and bringing them into the stud, the one thing that is pretty common is some of these younger bulls, they may go ahead and collect really well. They've got good semen quality, but they don't survive that post-thaw motility evaluation. So making sure that whatever you're using is doing a good job with that, make sure that's been evaluated well, make sure it's been put up properly. There are good custom collection facilities around, but when you're looking at semen quality, and Rick showed some data there, the bull studs, that's our lifeblood. We make sure that we provide a good product to customers, so make sure that what you're utilizing in terms of semen is good quality. And then we can mess it up in terms of the handling procedures. Making sure that we thaw it properly, making sure we do it in the right temperature. Just because you've got an electronic thaw does not mean that it's set at the right temperature. So here, before you start, to make sure you plug that thing in, make sure you've got a thermometer in there to make sure it's the right temperature. And then the other part of it is keeping those guns at the right temperature. If you're doing some fall breeding, so you're going to be AIing in the colder months of the year, making sure that you're handling that so it's not going to get a cold shock issue. Sire differences. Now, this is where we can get into a longer discussion, but basically there's no test out there that's available with repeatability to be able to evaluate sire fertility. The collection of the data, again, is difficult. The dairy, they do a pretty good job of it, but they've got a very consistent management that they're dealing with, plus all those records are gathered. We're still struggling to be able to gather that, especially in the U.S. South America does a pretty good job. We need to catch up on that, though, because that is an important part of that. And there's no means to measure among sires due to those variety of factors, such as synchronization, as the technician, where it's done. But that being said, we all know those sires that work well from a fixed time standpoint. And so as you talk to your semen suppliers, the bad part is usually by the time that we get to that point, they're 6 or 7 years old before we determine that. Communication through the entire process. One of my reps said the other day, he said, when I've talked to people about AI and they say, what are your expectations? They said, well, 80%. Well, we need to dial that back or you need to go somewhere else. Making sure who's going to bring the product. When you get there and you're putting seeders in, making sure who's going to bring the seeders, who's going to bring the product, the syringes, the timing of the event. And then as far as management of the cattle before, during, and after, there'll be other people talking about that, but that's critical. When we talk about this team, everybody's got to be accountable and everybody's got to be dedicated to making it happen. There's toolboxes that are available, and I would encourage you to look at those. As far as characteristics, just to review, the equation reproduction, you can't get around it no matter how hard you try. It's lowly heritable. So it's going to be a challenge regardless. There's no silver bullet. But you've got to keep the communication open. Everybody needs to know what their job is, and you've got to be accountable for what you're doing. So with that being said, I welcome you to Kansas. It's been a pleasure to be here in years past when they've done these, and I hope you gain a lot of knowledge with the information that will be shared.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Please join me in thanking Sandra. And our last speaker this morning before the break, Dr. Randall Spare. And Dr. Spare is going to talk about characteristics of successful breeding programs, a veterinarian's perspective. Dr. Spare has practiced in Ashland, Kansas for more than 25 years. He leads a multi-veterinarian practice, 4 other veterinarians in that practice. Serves a wide variety of clients out there, both seed stock, commercial cow-calf operations are a big part of the business, manages the herd health for some of the largest registered Angus seed stock producers. He also has his own cow-calf operation, so he brings both a veterinarian's perspective and a producer perspective. So please and welcome Dr. Spare.
Thanks, Dr. Odie. So I'm a little bit like Sandra. Many things that I'm going to talk about today I've learned from people like you. I'm a pretty slow learner, but when Sandy asked me to speak, I thought, well, veterinarian's perspective, I'm going to just talk about which vaccine to use. So we're going to use a little bit of this, and you know, your veterinarian come and you're wondering, where's the cerebral bullet? What can make all of my cows get bred on the first 21 days, and when they don't, it's your vet's fault. Okay? So what I've learned over the years is I've got to do a better job of communicating. Sometimes I've come with a silver bullet and said, you know, it's going to be all my responsibility whether the cows get bred or not. But you know what? It's a group effort. And I'd like to point out, recently we had a fire, and this cow in the middle, you'll notice that she's got some scars on her towards the back. She's a survivor. We let her decide to live, and that's her calf. And she had an udder that could produce colostrum. If you look on the other side of her, her left ear is burned off. And that's what each one of us are. We want to flourish today, and we as producers are in control. So as we want to move through this, I got to thinking, what can I bring to the table? So it's been mentioned that efficient reproduction equates to profitability, which means a sustainable operations. And we all know that today. So you have to have a reproductively efficient female. We've got to have early growth, end product merit. At the end of the day, we're going to add value to our cow herds and capture it. And but we all have to leave a cow in the pasture that's going to have some ability to reproduce efficiently. So I believe that the producers are in control. Each one of us are in control today. And we do that through 4 areas, 4 keys. And I simplify this, and this is going to be talked about over and over today, through genetic choices. It's the choices that we make. You and I are in control of those. I think this one becomes even more and more important. We know those cattle that are docile are going to perform better. And I'm a lot older than I was, and I don't run near as fast, and I want to walk, and I've been hurt enough, and each one of you have been too. But more importantly, those cattle that are tame need to be docile. Nutrition is important. We've on that already. I'll briefly touch my point, some of the traits of a nutrition program, and obviously health program. And so many times we come to the table and say, Doc, give me a health program so all my cows can get bred. And I used to think that was my responsibility, that the vaccination program that we provided will help them get everything bred and bred early. But let me tell you about a time. It was about 25 years ago. I was preg checking 140 cows one day. And in the morning, I preg checked 90 cows. And lo and behold, all 90 of them were bred. I kid you not. All 90 of them were bred, and it was a 60-day breeding season. And these people did a tremendous job. We went to lunch. We had a good time. Always enjoy the fall of the year. In the afternoon, we came back, and I was pregging these 40 cows. And I'm thinking, we're gonna get along good. The first cow was open. The second cow was open. The third cow was open. Well, they all were open. Well, about halfway through, the owner's wife was over there keeping score, I call it. She was about ready to come over and beat me. She thought it was my fault. Well, the good thing about it is this ranch was on a periphery, and I didn't fertility test that bull, and there's only one bull in that pasture. So, a lesson can be learned. Seldom do we find when we have low infertility, is it just one problem? No, just like that. That was pretty simple. And sometimes we look for the silver bullet when we have a problem. But it takes all of these four things to have a reproductive efficient cow herd. So the information is available. Here's a slide. It's a very busy slide, but it's a slide that I use every day when I try to think about how can I make an environment where that, pardon me, I'll get it. There we go. If we look at this slide, it's by Dr. Chase out of South Dakota, and it's really what we want to work at. So at the end of the day, when we get to this point, where if I get this right, this is when we're breeding this cattle, this animal, and this heifer, and we want her immune system to be as robust and full as possible. But we look back here just shortly after conception, and this animal is starting to build immunity here. So immunity is a lifetime experience starting at conception, and we have to make sure we're making the right decisions to create that possibility. And we do it through many facets, and we're going to talk about all of them today, and many of them more in depth than I obviously will. Also, one of the things that I want to make sure we look at is this white square. That's colostral intake. As you notice, immunity is at a very low level at the time of birth. That animal is so exposed. And I belabor that point because as a veterinarian, we look at, why is that calf sick? Is it off a heifer? Is it a twin off that heifer? My neighbor just had, he's an older gentleman, I often go over and help him. On Saturday, he had a set of twins born a week ago, and he'd been talking to me about them. The biggest calf off of that set of twins, he was lame, he had a big knee, his umbilicus was big, and it was just a reminder to me, Randall, it's all about colostral intake. Those animals that receive colostrum here are going to actually be more fertile in the long run. And so many times we say, yeah, they're all getting colostrum. It's not black and white. It is a degree of response to colostral intake, and we need to make the environment for those animals to calve, that calf to get up and nurse and fill its belly full of colostrum. So we can do that. Those are our choices on how we can make that possible. So I think if you'll take a slide like this and take it to heart, you can learn a lot to say, how can I apply this to my operation? So let's look about cow health. The cornerstone of a herd health program is to know what our BBD status is. When I graduated from veterinary school, the only tool we had was vaccinate. Got to vaccinate for BBD. Well, it was about 15 years ago we became able to test for that persistently infected calf. I took a friend of mine, and I have a friend that we test all their animals, and we started that shortly after that. IHC test was the gold standard, and we could test every animal to determine whether they were a PI calf. One of my first cow herds that we always had trouble, and the guy was going to blame it on my vaccination program. Well, lo and behold, we found a PI calf in 1,600 calves this time of year. We thought it was coccidiosis. We ear-notched that calf. He was a PI calf. Ended up the next spring, we decided to test all those calves. There was 16 calves. 1% of that calf crop was persistently infected. So that was a tool that we used at that time. And I contend today that persistently infected BVD is still a problem out there. There's still typhoid Marys out there in each cow herd. We see it and talk about it continually. Just because I bought my calves at Beaver, that's a clean area. I bought my calves at Woodward or Pratt. That's not the case. BVD is a clustered disease. There'll be 15 herds will be free of it, but then one herd with it. We just this last spring we had a set of calves, very well managed, vaccinate continually, but they had a PI calf when all their calves got sick after a stressful the time period when we had that snowstorm in western Kansas. They broke. So a persistently infected BVD continues to be a problem, and it's a three-legged stool. You've got to test for it, make sure it stays out of your herd. You got to vaccinate at the appropriate time. And the other word that I kind of yawned at when I was in veterinary school is biosecurity. You got to keep your cows out of somebody else's cow herd and theirs out of yours. We got to have better fences. And in Clark County, Kansas, right now, our fences need some help. So you got to know. So here's a big question, and I'm not going to go into all of it. You got to use modified live. You got to use killed vaccine. I think both of those vaccines, by any company we choose, for the most part, can provide the protection that we need when used at the appropriate time and the appropriate place. And it's about timing. I had an opportunity to go to Russia, and I got to tell this story because it brings it home. There was about 15,000 head of heifers developed in Garden City. And the Russians, you had to follow the protocol to the T because everybody wanted to point the finger at somebody else. So the protocol on the vaccine says vaccinate twice prior to breeding. These heifers did a wonderful job gathering these heifers up. They were vaccinated 2 times in late when the cedars were put in. They gave them the first vaccine and another time later, modified live. And I don't think it matters what company we use. And I'm not picking on a company here. Those cattle were, then they were bred July the 4th, and it was really hot that summer, 104. Their conception rate wasn't very good. In October, they were put on a ship to Galveston. They were put on a ship, and for 3 weeks they were on a ship. So I think that we've added stress to their life. Wouldn't you say? And by the way, when they're in the feed yard, they were put through the chute 20 times, even in a low-stress fashion. So there was stress in their life. So the picture is when we add stress and a vaccination program that would appear to be right, but maybe it's wrong. When they got to Russia, in January, the Russians wanted to give them another somewhat modified live prior to calving. They were given 2 doses of an attenuated modified live. Shortly after they had those 20,000 head of cattle, and they started to have early embryonic, or they had abortions, weak calf syndromes, retained placentas, the whole myriad of problems. Weak calves. We found, I happened to show up there and at that same time, and we find IBR rotating through their cow herd. The problem is, it wasn't the vaccine, it was the timing of it, and we have to be careful. So ask your veterinarian, we've got to use the right timing with the right vaccine. And there's a really nice study out of Auburn to show that maybe we should be there's an opportunity, once heifers are bred, if we use 2 doses of modified live prior to breeding, and then following that using killed vaccine, it's a very safe and efficacious way to do it. I contend it's like shooting a basketball. If I shoot anywhere and it hits the goal and goes in, whether it swishes or hits the backboard, it's still 2 points, right? Just because we vaccinate and vaccinate often doesn't mean we get better, more robust responses. I think we have to be careful how we use it and ask ourselves what's the appropriate way. So there's my spiel on modified live versus killed. Got to use them right. Obviously, Vibrio and Lepto still are problems. challenges. We got to do that. And here again, you've got to match. Lepto is a very short-acting immunity, and if you have a lepto problem in your area, I think that you need to consider using maybe twice a year and timing it when they're going to be exposed. So the information available on our health choices in our cow herd. We touched quite a few bulls. We need to talk about BBD in bulls. Same thing. If you buy bulls, your seed stock producer needs to know that they're BBD PI negative. The other challenge is if your bulls are purchased from a bull test station and they don't test all of the bulls, just because your bull's tested negative, BBD has a unique and a very efficient way of hiding out. If you have 100 bulls in a pen and you have one PI and he's spreading BBD every day of his life, even though those other bulls don't get sick and die or even become sick, if you have a bull, the BBD can cross and get in the scrotum and in the testicle and lay there for 18 months. That's a problem, wouldn't you say? So if you buy bulls, know that they're BBD free. And I test a lot of bulls, and it's almost more important that we know their BBD status rather than feel their testicles. Trick, huge issue. I think that I've discovered an area that we have another area hot spot of trick. We have to be aware of that. When you buy a bull, buy a virgin bull, buy a young bull, don't go to the sale barn. And I have clients come to me and said, I don't want to keep a bull around all year. I want to lease it. I know many of you, I'm going to step on toe. That's a really bad idea. And it makes me ill, really ill. Did you know we can test a bull one time for trick? If it's present, we have an 85% chance of finding it. 2 times we're up to about 90, and 3 times we're at 98 if we're using a PCR. We can't take those risks. I wouldn't. It makes me very concerned about trichomoniasis. So biosecurity is huge with trick. Know who your neighbors are. Know what their practices are. Trick is a biosecurity disease, and we have to use good common sense. Vaccination. Those bulls need to be vaccinated for Vibrio lepto once a year. And finally, the semen evaluation. It's not only do they have the product, but can they deliver the product? Dr. Odie's getting nervous. He thinks I'm talking too long. Docility is important. It's important not to have sporty animals. We know those animals that are wild they cause a problem. We know that slide I showed you about colostral intake. Those calves from cows that are tame that will get up and allow their calves to nurse, they're going to have better colostrum. Those calves are going to gain better. They're going to have better production all their life and also be more reproductively efficient. So I like to use this point. That's a highly heritable trait. The flip side of that, 64% is our fault. Think about that. We need to train our people. We need to have good facilities. I go to a place, actually I don't go because I don't pull that straw anymore. We go to a family operation, great people. There's 10 people there. We preg check 300 cows in about 4 hours or 3 hours. Everybody has 2 weapons. They have a little bitty short alley and a terrible way to get them in. Those cattle are wild. Let me tell you another problem with that place. Their calves were shipped on a video auction, and shortly after they were there, they were shipped on a Wednesday. By Sunday, they'd mass medicated all of them. Temperament's a huge issue, and it's our responsibility as caretakers. It's an animal welfare issue. We have got to take responsibility, and that's a leadership issue within each ranch. We've got to demonstrate how to care for animals. We can use genetic choice pressure, use percentile choice for dose bulls selection. That trait is true. I can tell when those bulls come through the chute what their are by their tell who XD is in the ground. I'll put it away. information is available. Our choice, and we're in control. Nutrition is going to be a lot of talk to nutrition. From our vantage, we body can do weak herds. We can rise those herds and help produce enough. So I'm out of time. I'll flip this. Dr. Arden, he got meeting tickets to Ashland looking at the program. Genetics, it's not going to use top 5% CED. We can top 1% our cow herd, a calf out in the pasture, and they just go to discover them once a day. Who's there? Heifer pregnancies are great. So here's a put it all together. He's a Kansas, has a small herd of 150 cows. Summer he sold his cow. There was 6-7 steer cow herd. 7 steer. They were on 130 days. The market that $1.09. They sold for $1.32 with a $175 premium. If we look at that, that's $11,000. That's like extra 10, and I 10 that is that reproductive cow. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're all in control, and it's how we put it all together. So, thank you very much.
We are now scheduled for a break, and a couple of announcements before we go. Number one, I encourage you to visit the booths at the trade show. A lot of these people have come long distances and take advantage of this opportunity to learn more about their offerings and their technology. Number two, I want to ask you to return promptly at 10:40. I also want to, at this time, I want to thank all of our speakers at this point for staying on time. Sandy gave me strict instructions, and I think our speakers have done a very, very good job of staying on time. So be back at 10:40. Sandy, is there any other announcements that we need to make at this time? If you do have questions, put those questions on those cards, and I think Sandy and her team will actually be collecting those.